The morning David was ordered out of the library, she was in the middle of refolding a deed from 1792. Her hands were steady. The parchment was not. It had been rolled too tight for too long, and the edges lifted in small, insistent curls the moment she released the pressure. She pressed 2 fingertips flat against the lower corner, waited, and kept her eyes on the paper. The door to the corridor was open. The voices in the adjacent drawing room were not quiet. Constance Hale had that kind of voice, carrying, clipped, certain of its own importance in every room it entered. "These people are contracted through the firm," Constance was saying, and David understood without looking up that she meant herself, the only contracted person currently working on the Hale archive. "They are not guests when the solicitors arrive. I want the library cleared." David pressed the corner of the deed flat, held it, and breathed slowly through her nose. She had been at Hale Manor for 5 weeks by then. She had known from the first afternoon that Constance regarded her as a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong room. She was a conservator, brought in through an estate management firm to assess and restore the document archive in the Manor's East Wing library. She had references, credentials, a careful pair of hands, and 22 years of experience with materials that other people had given up on. None of that interested Constance. What interested Constance was the precise maintenance of a social order in which David occupied the lowest visible rung, and the order was enforced daily, in small, efficient gestures. David set the deed in its conservation sleeve and moved to the next item in the sorting tray. She had been doing that for 5 weeks, setting things carefully in their places, moving to the next. The story begins, properly, 3 days after she arrived. Hale Manor sat inside 40 acres of grounds in the county's oldest residential corridor, a stone house of the kind that had been built to outlast several generations, and had succeeded, though the current generation seemed to regard it primarily as a financial instrument. The estate had been managed by Constance since the death of Raymond Hale, her husband's brother, 3 years prior. She occupied the East Wing, hosted dinners for county families twice a season, and kept a staff of 5 permanent employees who understood their terms. Vera Lund was the housekeeper. She had been on the estate for 11 years. She was a compact, efficient woman in her mid-50s who wore her grey-streaked hair pulled back with a clip that she always touched before speaking, as though she were checking that she was properly assembled. She had met David at the service entrance on the first morning with a ring of keys and a brief, assessing look that was not unkind. "The East Library," Vera had said, handing over a single, smaller key, "hasn't been opened properly in 2 years. Mrs. Hale asked that the room stay undisturbed until the firm sent someone with the right credentials." She paused with one hand on the corridor door. "She'll introduce herself to you after lunch. She prefers to introduce herself after lunch." David had thanked her. Vera had given her one more look and then said, plainly, "You'll find it worth the effort. The collection is significant." That was the closest anyone at Hale Manor came to warmth in the first several days. The library was, in fact, significant. David had known that from the intake documents, but the intake documents had not fully conveyed the condition of the oldest materials, which had been stored without proper humidity regulation for at minimum 2 decades and possibly longer. 3 of the bound ledgers from the mid-18th century had sustained water damage that rendered the outer pages nearly illegible. There were map folios rolled and stacked in a cedar chest that had not been catalogued. There were family correspondence bundles wrapped in deteriorating cloth that had fused to the outermost letters. Every morning David came in before 7, unlocked the library, turned on the work lamp above the conservation table, and began. She worked alone for the first week. She ate lunch at the small table near the window, looking out at the grounds while she read through the catalogue she was building on her laptop, cross-referencing holdings against the firm's records. Constance had made it clear at their introductory meeting that meals for contracted staff were available in the kitchen at 12 and 6, that she was not to access the drawing room without an invitation, and that any questions about the archive's history were to be routed through the estate manager rather than raised directly. David had written all of this down in her notebook, thanked Constance for the orientation, and returned to the library. What Constance had not accounted for, because she rarely accounted for things that did not announce themselves, was that the library's ventilation system ran along the same duct line as the drawing room. Sound moved freely between the two rooms when the duct covers were open. David discovered this on her fourth day, when she heard a phone conversation of Constance's from 8 feet away through the wall. She had not listened then. She had simply noted the architectural fact and closed the cover on her side as far as it would go. She had not yet learned how much that fact would matter. It was on the third day of her second week that she first saw him. She had gone outside at noon to eat her lunch on the low stone wall beside the kitchen garden, where the light was better than the kitchen and the air was less closely managed than anywhere else on the grounds. She had her thermos and half a cheese sandwich and was sitting with one knee drawn up, watching a crow investigate the base of the yew hedge, when a man came around the corner of the outbuilding carrying a pair of pruning tools and a coil of garden twine. He was wearing worn canvas work trousers and a dark jacket that had been washed many times. His hands were in heavy leather gloves. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried gait of someone who was used to the grounds and had no particular opinion about being watched on them. He stopped at the corner of the outbuilding, noted her presence with a brief look, and then crossed toward the tool store without comment. David finished her sandwich. The crow abandoned the yew hedge and moved on. She saw him again 2 days later, at the east edge of the grounds where the oak trees thinned. He was repairing a section of stone wall that had crumbled in the autumn wet, working the stones back into their mortared courses with a steadiness that suggested either professional skill or very long practice. She walked that path each morning when she arrived, and she had been aware of the damage to the wall for a week. She had mentioned it to Vera as a passing observation. Now, someone was fixing it. His name, she learned from Vera the next day, was Cal. He had been taken on as additional ground staff 3 weeks before David arrived, working directly under Vera's general oversight rather than under the grounds manager, because the grounds manager had left the estate in the summer and had not yet been replaced. He kept his own hours. He was quiet. "Competent?" David asked. Vera touched her hair clip. "Very," she said, and moved on to the subject of the archive's temperature logs. David returned the name Cal to its place in her mental accounting of the manor's inhabitants and went back to work. It was the following Thursday when the small kindness beat arrived, unremarkable in the moment, without witnesses of any consequence. David had walked out to the kitchen garden again at noon. The day had turned cold and she had her coat, and she was carrying her lunch in the paper bag the kitchen assembled for her each day. A sandwich, a hard-cooked egg, a small container of soup in a sealed cup. She had reached the stone wall and was setting her bag down when she heard a short, frustrated sound from behind the outbuilding. She looked around the corner. Cal was standing over an overturned canvas bag. His lunch, a single thermos, and what had been a wrapped packet of bread and meat, scattered across the gravel where the bag had fallen from the wall shelf. The thermos had rolled. The bread had landed face down. The meat was on the gravel. He looked at it. He did not look at her. "Here," David said. She held out her paper bag. "Take mine." He straightened and met her eyes for the first time. He had pale grey eyes, lighter than she expected, and an expression she could not immediately name. Not surprise, exactly. Something older than surprise. "I couldn't," he said. "The kitchen packed enough for 2, David told him, which was not true, but was the sort of thing she said when she wanted to make it easy for someone to accept a reasonable offer. Honestly, I eat too much soup. Take the sandwich. He took the sandwich. She ate the soup and the egg standing up, and they said very little for the 10 minutes they were both there. He asked whether the archive restoration was going well. She told him some of the materials were in worse condition than anticipated, and described briefly the problem with the water-damaged ledgers. He listened with the particular quality of attention that she associated with people who were actually thinking about what they heard, rather than waiting for a gap to speak. When she stood to go back inside, he said, "Thank you, Miss David." She had told him her name 2 days earlier in passing. She said, "It's just David," and he said, "I know." And she went inside thinking nothing particular about the exchange. The crow was back at the yew hedge. The following week carried its own rhythm. David catalogued 23 additional ledger volumes and began the more delicate work of separating the fused correspondence bundles without tearing the paper. Cal appeared at the window twice, once to rake the gravel path nearest the east wing, and once for no reason she could identify, pausing outside the glass to look at something on the ground for a long moment before moving on. She did not find this worth examining. People on ground staff paused in their work. It was a feature of the job. Constance hosted a dinner on Wednesday evening. David ate in the kitchen at 6 and left by 7, as she had been tacitly instructed to do. She heard the dinner conversation from the service corridor for 30 seconds while passing, and what she heard was Constance performing an inventory of county families for a guest whose voice she did not recognize, placing each family according to their property values, their marriages, and the prestige of the schools their children attended. It was a precise and efficient performance. The guest laughed in the right places. David went back to the East Wing, sat in the library for another hour and reread her notes on the map folios. Cal began appearing near the library window more regularly by the 3rd week. She noticed this the way she noticed the weather, as a fact of the environment, relevant, but not requiring interpretation. He would work on the adjacent path or tend the window boxes on the outer wall, and occasionally they would exchange a few words through the glass. And then he would move on. He asked about the maps once, specifically whether any of them were estate surveys. She said 2 of them appeared to be from the early 19th century, and that one showed a structure on the north end of the property that no longer existed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A gatehouse. It came down in the 40s. She asked how he knew. He said his family had been in the county a long time. She did not ask what family. People on estates often had deep-rooted local knowledge. It was another feature of the place. The conversation she was not meant to hear happened on a Friday afternoon in the 4th week. She had been working on one of the water-damaged ledgers for most of the morning, using the humidification chamber she'd brought in her kit to slowly release the fused pages. The work required long, careful intervals between each attempt, and during the waiting periods she had been organizing correspondence envelopes by date. The duct cover on her side of the shared wall was closed, as she always kept it. The cover on the drawing room side was apparently open. Constance's voice came through clearly around 3 in the afternoon, mid-sentence. "Of course, there is no heir. Raymond had no children. I have said this to every solicitor who has inquired, and I will say it to any estate court that requires a ruling." A pause, measured and comfortable. "The ring was buried with him. That was my explicit instruction to the funeral director, and it was carried out. There is nothing to inherit. The estate passes in accordance with Raymond's letter of intent, which I am the executor of, and which leaves management in my hands for as long as the property generates income." A second voice, lower and unintelligible. Constance again. "The ring is gone. The Hale family is gone. I am the only person on these grounds with any legitimate authority over this property, and I suggest you repeat that clearly to whoever sent you." A short laugh. "They can send their inquiries in writing." David sat very still. She held the correspondence envelope in both hands and looked at the duct cover in the wall and understood several things at once. The ring Constance was referring to was the Hale family seal ring, a signet piece that she had seen referenced in two of the estate's earliest correspondence documents, described as the recognized emblem of the eldest Hale and passed from head of household to heir. She had noted the reference in her catalogue with a cross-referencing flag, the way she catalogued every family detail in the archive that might bear on provenance or inheritance. She set the envelope down. 3 years since Raymond Hale had been declared dead. No heir, according to Constance. No surviving family. The ring buried by Constance's instruction. And yet, here was Constance on a Friday afternoon in apparent conversation with someone who had sent an inquiry, explaining with the confident boredom of someone who had said the same thing many times before that there was nothing left to inquire about. David breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slowly. She did not go to the drawing room. She did not make a note about what she had heard. She did not alter anything in her catalogue, or her schedule, or her afternoon's work. She picked up the next envelope, dated it, placed it in its sleeve, and moved to the one after that. She was a conservator. Her work was the archive. What she had heard in the walls was not her business, and she had no standing to make it her business, and even if she had, she would not have known what to do with it. What she did know was that something in the house was not what it had been presented to be, and that the man who had told her his family had been in the county a long time was working on the grounds under a name that was not his own. She did not say this last thought aloud. She barely permitted it to complete itself. She finished the afternoon's work, filed her daily notes, and locked the library at 7. The weekend passed. Cal was not visible on the grounds on Saturday. On Sunday he was raking the south path again, and she saw him through the window and did not go outside, and he did not look up at the glass. Monday morning she arrived at 7, unlocked the library, and sat down in front of the humidification chamber. The ledger's fused pages had relaxed over the weekend. She could begin the separation work. By 10 she had freed 6 pages without a tear. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not hear Cal come to the window until he said quietly, "I heard about the dinner Saturday. Were you invited?" She looked up. He was standing with both arms resting on the stone window ledge, his gloves on, his jacket's collar turned up against the morning cold. He looked like he had been there for a moment already. "No," she said. He nodded once. "Did you want to be?" She considered this with her brush held still above the open ledger. "I was brought here to restore the archive," she said. "I am restoring the archive." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him directly. "I don't require invitations, if that's what you mean. I know what I'm here to do." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "What you do is remarkable work." He said it the way someone might say a thing they had been holding for a while, plainly, without decoration. Bringing something deteriorated back to a condition where it can be read, that's not nothing. She felt something move in her chest that she chose not to name. "Thank you," she said, and returned to the page. He stayed at the window for a few minutes more, not speaking, and then pushed off the ledge and walked on. Vera came to the library at noon with a message from Constance. The East Wing was to be prepared for a formal visit from the estate solicitors on the following Thursday. David was to complete her current day's work and leave the library in proper order. She would not be working in the East Wing on Thursday. "She wants the room empty," David asked. She wants the conservator's materials tidied and put away, Vera said carefully. You can resume on Friday. David looked at Vera for a moment. Vera touched her hair clip. Is there anything I should know? David said. About Thursday? Vera's expression shifted in a way that was too small to name clearly. She said, The solicitors come from Hartwell and Crane. They have managed the Hale estate accounts for 22 years. They know the property well. She paused. They knew Raymond well. She said this, and then she said nothing else, and left. David spent the rest of the week working carefully and thoroughly. She finished the separation on the water damage ledger and began work on the map folios, pressing each survey flat under weighted boards and leaving them overnight to hold their new dimensions. She catalogued the correspondence bundles by decade, labeling each sleeve with the sender's name where legible and with a description where it was not. She did not think about Thursday more than was necessary. On Wednesday evening, as she was locking up, she encountered Cal on the corridor. He had apparently been walking from the direction of the east staircase, which was unusual. Ground staff did not typically have reason to come through the East Wing corridor. He stopped when he saw her. Working late, he said. There was more to finish than I expected, she said. The map folios. She looked at him for a moment in the low light of the corridor. He had his gloves on his hand, but they were loosely held, not worn, as though he had just pulled them off and then put them back on. She noticed his hands were clean. The skin above the glove line was free of the roughness she associated with sustained outdoor work. She noticed this and said nothing about it. The folios, he said. The estate surveys. Yes. He looked at the closed library door. He said, You've done good work here. She heard the past tense. She said, I'm resuming on Friday. He looked at her. Good, he said. He walked on toward the service exit. Thursday arrived with the weight of a held breath. David had not been asked to be present for the solicitor's visit. She understood her role precisely. She was to clear her materials from the visible surfaces of the East Wing, make the library presentable, and absent herself from the East Wing entirely for the morning. She had done this. She was working in her room in the contractor's quarters when Constance arrived at 10:10. She heard the knock at her door with a specific quality of intent that she recognized immediately. Constance opened the door without waiting. Behind her, at the end of the contractor's corridor, David could see two men in suits, unhurried, briefcases in hand. The solicitors, apparently. They had arrived early. Miss David. Constance's voice was perfectly measured, warm in the way that public-facing authority performs warmth. I'm glad you're here. I need you to understand that our arrangement with the estate firm is under review. She said this as though she were discussing a minor scheduling adjustment. Until the review is complete, your access to the East Wing is suspended. Today, I am going to need you to hand over the library key. David looked at her. She was aware of the two men standing behind Constance in the corridor, aware of her own bag on the table, aware of the key in her coat pocket. The firm's contract runs through the end of November, David said. Contracts can be reviewed, Constance said, and extended her hand. David reached into her pocket and placed the key in Constance's hand. She did it with the same plain, unhurried motion she brought to everything. No argument in her face, no performance of compliance, simply the act. Constance closed her fingers around the key. Thank you, she said, in the tone of someone who has confirmed a suspicion. She turned back toward the corridor. One of the solicitors had stepped forward. He was a tall man, grey-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that fit well. He was looking past Constance toward the end of the contractor's corridor, and he had an expression David could not interpret at that distance. The other solicitor was looking at the same point. David followed their sightline. Cal was standing at the end of the corridor. He had come through from the east wing door, which opened onto the service passage at the back of the contractor's hall. He was wearing the same worn jacket he always wore. He had his gloves in his left hand. His right hand was bare. On his right hand, on the middle finger, was a signet ring, dark gold. The seal face was an H, deeply carved, set within a border that was visible from across the corridor to anyone who knew what they were looking for. The taller solicitor said, clearly and without hesitation, Marcus Hale. The name filled the corridor the way cold fills a room when a door opens. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It simply occupied all the space that had previously been occupied by the arrangement Constance had been maintaining. Constance turned. She turned the way a structure turns when a load-bearing element is removed. Not all at once, but with the abrupt, involuntary quality of something that has been pretending to hold for a while and has now stopped pretending. "That ring," she said, and stopped. "Mrs. Hale," the taller solicitor said, and the way he said her name now was different from how he would have said it 10 seconds ago. The tone had shifted entirely. It contained a new weight, a professional reckoning. "We received notification of Mr. Hale's return through our office last week. He asked that we come to the estate this morning." Constance said, "I was told and did not finish." She said, "The funeral director confirmed," and did not finish that either. She looked at the ring on Marcus's hand and said, "I gave explicit instructions that it was to be," and she stopped on the word "to be." And the word hung in the corridor, and she did not retrieve it. The shorter solicitor had opened his briefcase. He produced a folder without hurrying. "We'll need to review the estate accounts and the management documentation," he said, in a tone that was entirely office-bound, entirely procedural. "Going back to the transfer of management authority. That would be 3 years." He paused. "We will need a full accounting." Marcus walked down the corridor. He walked past Constance without looking at her, and the two solicitors stepped aside naturally as he passed, the way people step aside for someone they know to be the authoritative presence in a room, even when the room does not yet know it. He stopped beside David. He looked at her with those pale grey eyes, unhurried, steady. "Your key," he said. He held out his right hand, the signet ring fully visible, and waited. Constance, still standing at the centre of the corridor, said, "She doesn't have it. I asked her to." And then she looked at her own closed hand and opened it, and the key was there. She looked at the key for a moment that cost her something. Marcus held out his hand toward Constance. Constance placed the key in his palm. She did it with the mechanical motion of someone whose body still knows the required gesture, even when the will that used to command it has gone somewhere else entirely. Marcus held the key for a moment, then turned and offered it to David. "You're not done with the archive," he said. It was not a question. She took the key. She held it by the bow, the same way she always held it, and looked at him and said, "The map folios still need the final pressing. The water-damaged ledger is separated but not yet reinforced, and there are 3 correspondence bundles I haven't dated." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. The thing that comes before a smile when someone has been given back something they weren't sure they'd see again. "Friday, then," he said. "Friday," she said. The solicitors had moved with the quiet efficiency of men who have been waiting for a specific event for 3 years and are now prepared to work quickly. They followed Marcus toward the east wing, briefcases in hand, papers already in order. The shorter one paused at the library door and asked Marcus something in a low voice, and Marcus said yes, and they went inside. Vera appeared at the corridor's far end. She had clearly been nearby for some time. She looked at Constance, still standing in the middle of the corridor, and then she looked at David with an expression that had been carefully plain for as long as David had known her. And that was now, briefly, something else. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something more like the feeling of a long-held breath finally released. She walked past Constance without speaking and came to stand near David. The library, Vera said quietly, has not been properly cared for in more than 20 years. I'm glad someone with the right hands got to it. David looked at her. You knew who he was. Vera touched her hair clip. I knew who Cal wasn't, she said simply. Constance left the East Wing corridor without speaking again. David heard her heels on the stone floor, measured and distinct, retreating toward the West Wing, and then the sound diminished, and the corridor was quiet. She would not leave Hale Manor that day, David thought. She was not the kind of person who could leave immediately. She would need to spend time in her rooms, reassembling the version of herself that addressed the world from a position of complete authority, before she could emerge again and begin renegotiating her position. She would find it was a different negotiation than she had conducted for the last 3 years. She would find the terms had changed. That was not David's business. That had never been David's business. Her business was the archive. She went to the library door and looked in. The 2 solicitors were at the far end of the room with Marcus, the taller one pointing to a shelf of bound accounts ledgers that David had not yet worked through. Marcus was listening with his arms at his sides, the gloves gone now, his hands bare. The ring was a plain and quiet thing at this distance, ordinary as a hinge on a door. The shorter solicitor was speaking. The property holdings, as registered, include the 40 acres of grounds, the manor and outbuildings, the trust funds in Raymond's name that have been held in suspension since his death, and the mineral rights on the north parcels, all of which revert to you as the sole heir. He paused, his pen over his notebook. Mrs. Hale's management authority was contingent on there being no surviving heir. That condition no longer applies. Marcus said, I know. She may contest it. She won't succeed, Marcus said. The taller solicitor nodded. We'll have the preliminary documents ready by next week. You'll need to be present to sign. I'll be here, Marcus said. David stepped inside. She crossed to her conservation table. She set her bag down, pulled the key from her pocket, and set it on the edge of the table beside her thermos. She drew on her cotton gloves, lifted the cloth away from the map folio she had left weighted the night before, and checked the 4 corners. The right corner had held. The left had not quite. It needed another hour under pressure. She replaced the weight and sat down. Behind her she heard the solicitors gathering their papers, heard Marcus saying something about the afternoon, heard footsteps moving back towards the corridor. She did not turn. She had her work to return to, and she returned to it. She heard one set of footsteps stop behind her. The gatehouse survey, Marcus said. The one from the early 19th century. I'd like to see it when it's ready. She turned in her chair. He was standing 4 feet away, his jacket pushed back with one hand in his pocket, looking at the folio on the table with the expression she had seen at the window many times over the past weeks, the attentive, unhurried look of someone who is thinking carefully about what he sees. It needs another 2 days under the boards, she said. I know how to wait, he said. The solicitors were gone. The corridor beyond the open library door was empty. The manor had the particular mid-morning quiet that belonged to it naturally, the kind of quiet that existed before anyone had decided what the day would be. She looked at the ring on his right hand. She had seen it before without knowing what she was seeing. She had noticed it the morning he helped her pick up the dropped conservation sleeve in the kitchen passage, when his glove had slipped and she had caught a flash of something gold at his finger. She had filed it as a family piece. She had not looked for it again. She had not known how to look for it, because she had not known she was supposed to. You came back to see whether anyone here was worth trusting, she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question, which was how she had intended it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 years is a long time to be gone. People make arrangements in the space a person leaves. I wanted to see what arrangements had been made and who had been making them before I announced myself. He paused. I also wanted to know whether anyone on these grounds was what they appeared to be, whether the work being done here was being done with any real care. He glanced at the conservation table, the organized sleeves, the folio under its boards. The archive had been deteriorating for 20 years. No one had thought it worth attending to. Until the firm sent someone, David said. Until the firm sent someone, he agreed. She thought about the lunch she had given him, the cheese sandwich on the gravel path, without knowing she was being watched by anyone who mattered or tested by anything she would have recognized as a test. She thought about the mornings at the window, the questions about the maps, the careful attention that she had catalogued as a feature of his personality without understanding the context that made it specific and deliberate. She thought about Constance's voice through the duct cover, the confident claim that the ring was buried and the heir was gone, and the authority belonged to the person who had outlasted the original holder. She thought about what it meant that she had heard it and continued working. The correspondence bundles, she said, turning back to the table. The ones I haven't dated yet. Some of them are addressed in a hand that matches the signatures in the early ledgers. Raymond's correspondence, I think, from the first decade of his management. She picked up one of the labelled sleeves. You may want to look at them when they're processed. She felt him come to stand beside the table. Yes, he said, I would. There was a pause, and in it, the quiet of the library settled around them both, the morning light holding its angle across the parchment and the weighted boards and the rows of careful work she had done over 5 weeks in a room where no one of consequence had thought to look. She set the sleeve down. She picked up her brush. She held it above the map folio and waited for his next question, or for him to leave, or for whatever the remainder of this day would ask of her. He stayed. He stayed and she worked, and the library held them both inside its particular quiet, which was the quiet of very old paper that has waited a long time to be properly read and has finally been given into the right hands. She turned the next sleeve over, an address in brown ink, faded but legible. Raymond Hale in his own hand, writing to someone on the North Parcels about a survey dispute that had been settled before anyone now living had been born. She would catalogue this one carefully. She always did.